Jim and Barbara.
Written by Johnny Fist. Jim and Barbara were a young American couple who had married not long ago and were still enjoying life and each other's company. They tried to spend as much time together as possible, so the small trip Barbara suggested was received by both of them with enthusiasm. Barbara loved Kentucky. This was connected to her childhood memories when her father used to take her there. He was a traveling salesman and often took her along on his business trips. He visited many towns and cities, large and small, but it was Kentucky that stayed with Barbara the most. Almost 20 years had passed since she stopped traveling with her father and fully immersed herself in the routine of adult life. In that time, she had finished college, found a good job, and married Jim. Now she decided it would be nice to revisit her childhood memories. So she and Jim got into the car and set off. The state of Kentucky is not among the most popular in the USA. It is a land of working people who labor 6 days a week at factories and plants to pay their mortgages and afford a Saturday evening barbecue with beer. Small but cozy houses were home to those very people, real Americans. Barbara's father had noticed even back then that the child had a particular fondness for this state. He could not understand why. Of course, everyone loved New York or Los Angeles, cities where the dreams of a few come true. But Kentucky? Even Bill himself, Barbara's father, did not like the state. It seemed bleak to him, yet Barbara loved it. When asked what exactly she liked about it, Barbara would just shrug and say, "Just because." Inspired by these memories, Barbara threw their bags into the boot of the car and together with Jim, set off for Kentucky. After driving 200 miles, they finally reached the long-awaited state. The whole way, Barbara peered out of the window and commented to Jim on everything they passed. Here was the shop, where a married couple had worked all their lives. Here was the church where Reverend Jerome preached, and here was a small poultry farm. She commented on everything she remembered from early childhood. Their first overnight stop was at a hotel called By the Roadside. The name might sound amusing, but in every state, and sometimes in every small town across America, there were 1 or 2 hotels with exactly that name. The owners found it very original and believed it was the name that attracted guests. Jim and Barbara took their bags from the boot and carried them into the room. It was clean and well kept. They tossed the bags into a corner and went to take a shower to wash off the road dust. After a bite to eat and grabbing a small handbag for their walk, the two of them left their room and went out to stroll around the town a little. They did not remember the town's name, and it didn't really matter. Barbara wanted to look at the faces of the people who lived there and talk to them. Jim and Barbara wandered along the small streets, chatted with locals, drank coffee, and breathed in the air. While they were sitting outside a cafe, a young man approached them. Nothing about his appearance suggested desperation, yet he began begging for money. Jim and Barbara gave him $5, but the young man would not let up. He asked for more, pointing out that it was obvious they were not locals and surely had far more money than $5, and that they could easily throw in another 10 or 2. Jim politely asked him to leave, but the man persisted. Barbara joined in, but her attempts to get rid of the beggar were just as futile. A fight broke out. The young man struck Jim first. With savage fury, he rained blows down on him. Jim tried to defend himself. Even Barbara, screaming, tried to pull them apart. Nothing helped until a couple of locals intervened. They managed to drag the aggressive man away and help Jim to his feet. The man threatened Jim and Barbara and quickly disappeared. Jim, with a split lip and a small bruise under his eye, was bewildered by what had happened. He began to mutter sarcastically to Barbara, mocking her praise of this state, this wonderful town, and how wonderful the people here were. After receiving first aid, Jim and Barbara decided to return to their room. Jim no longer wanted to walk around. He just wanted to spend the night, recover from the long drive and what had happened, and then move on. They returned to the room after dark. Talking about the incident, they went to bed. Jim could not fall asleep for a long time. while Barbara closed her eyes and immediately sank into a deep sleep. Around midnight, Jim heard noise outside. Someone was clearly walking near their door and talking. There were 2 or 3 of them. Jim woke Barbara. They lay together in bed, listening to the voices coming from outside their door. Suddenly the door burst open and 3 masked men rushed into the room. They immediately threw themselves at Jim and Barbara, dragged them from the bed, and pinned them to the floor. When the commotion subsided and the intruders stuffed gags into Jim's and Barbara's mouths, one of them removed his mask. It was the very beggar who had earlier started the fight with Jim over $5. Somehow he had tracked them down and clearly wanted revenge for not getting what he believed he was owed. He paced the room, threatening them. Terrified, Barbara could only sob behind the gag, unable to say a word. Jim calmly followed what was happening. The 2 heavy-set men holding them down must have weighed close to 100 kilos each. Resisting them was difficult and seemed pointless. The young man who did most of the talking and threatening, already known to Jim and Barbara, searched the entire room, turned their bags inside out, and took all the money from their wallets. It seemed that was it. They would take what they had come for and leave. Jim already imagined how, after such humiliation, he and Barbara would not even wait until morning, but would get straight into the car and drive home. He was just waiting for them to leave. But things did not go as Jim hoped. After taking all their money, the young man looked out of the window to check whether anyone was coming. Then, with a slight nod, he signaled to his companions. Without hesitation, they pulled out knives and slit Jim's and Barbara's throats. Barbara died almost instantly. Jim, bleeding heavily, still tried to cling to life. The robbers immediately fled, closing the door behind them. It seemed routine for them to break into strangers' rooms, rob them, and kill them. After all, what was difficult about that? It was far harder to find a respectable job with a decent salary and a sane boss. Harder to plan one's life 20 years ahead. Harder to find a woman with whom one wanted to spend an entire lifetime. Jim, it seemed, had overcome all those difficulties. He had all of it. But now, lying in the by-the-roadside hotel in the state of Kentucky, a place he had disliked from the very start, with his throat cut and bleeding out in the final moments of his life, staring at the window, he understood that his life was coming to an end without ever really having begun. Jim realized he would never see Barbara again and would never again drink beer with his friends while watching the Super Bowl. These were the thoughts racing through his mind. Why do people say that in the final moments of life one's whole life flashes before one's eyes? No, his was not like that. He did not think about what had been. He thought about what would never be. Taking one short final breath, Jim died. In the morning, the police would find their bodies and classify the case as one that absolutely had to be investigated, but most likely it would remain unsolved. People there were used to that. Jim and Barbara, who had dreamed of a wonderful journey, set off on another one, their last, one that might not hold many bright memories, but which would certainly be final.